Hi, this is Gage from Why God Why. We're in the midst of a season titled The Credibility of Christianity, and we are diving into all types of topics like faith and science, politics, diversity, faith and beauty or superficiality, and more. And as we go through this season, we want to hear from you. We're going to do an episode at the very end of the season where we discuss the whole season and respond to listener questions. So as you listen along and you think, hey, I wish they talked about that question further, or they didn't really hit on this topic related to the episode, we'd love to hear from you and get a chance to discuss it together. So as you're listening along, if that occurs to you, send your question you'd like us to discuss to peter@browncroft.org. If you're extra savvy, send us a recording of your voice actually asking the question, and we can include that in the episode. We'll only share your name if you give us permission, but we'd love to hear from you. With that, enjoy the episode. Well, hello and welcome to Why God Why. I am Gage Hunt, and I get to co-host this episode with John Iamaio. Hi, John.
Hey, Gage, you're right there.
Yeah,
it's great. Great to be alongside you, and great to be co-hosting with you today because we get to interview one of my favorite people on the planet. So this is going to be a great time.
Yeah.
Maybe not for any of our listeners, but definitely for me, and I hope for Sasha over there as well. And hopefully you can, guide this conversation in a healthy way. So congratulations, Gage, for being for being involved in this. So anyway, there you go.
I'll do my best. We are excited. We are in the midst of a season titled The Credibility of Christianity. And Why God Why is a podcast that exists to dive into some of the questions that potentially feel uncomfortable to bring up in church or sometimes in your Christian groups. And so we're doing this season, The Credibility of Christianity, diving into various topics that people bring up in questioning why they would feel Christianity is a credible worldview or faith system. In general, we're talking about things like science, philosophy, impact. And today, we're talking about an interesting topic that might not always come first to mind when thinking about credibility, but I think will be a rich conversation. We're talking about Christianity and art. And to do that, we have a special guest, Sasha Hallock, who is a friend of yours.
Yes. I would say dear friend.
Dear friend.
Yeah.
So I've just met him. Sasha is an Iranian American artist living and working in New York City. He did not grow up in a religious home and in fact became a Christian while he was studying painting and drawing in college. Alongside working as a professional artist, Sasha works with Transform Arts in the Arts and Culture division of Crew, which is a nonprofit. He's passionate about translating the beauty of the gospel into the language of creatives. Welcome, Sasha.
Thank you guys so much for having me. It's wonderful to be here.
Yeah. It's great to have you, Sash.
We are super glad to have you here with us today.
Yeah. Look at you. You're so comfortable in your house. You're sipping your espresso. You're in front of some books and some art.
I will say a large part of that comfort is that my children are in school, and so this is a happy time. This is a peaceful time.
Good.
And I did warn Gage. John and I are dear friends, and so we're going to try to keep this thing moving. But it's just so good to see you.
I know.
It's so good to see you.
Yeah.
Well, we'll try to wrap it up.
And great job on the podcast.
This is fun. This is fun.
We've got time.
That's right.
I've really enjoyed listening to the podcast.
Oh, that's awesome, man. That's awesome. Well, let me start it off with you, Sash, because I grew up during a time that, let's just say, was maybe the peak of cheesiness in the Christian realm in regards to Christianity and the arts. And I don't know if people who are listening today have had this experience, but I grew up, I think the 90s may have been the apex of it. And some people were really driven away during that time. let me just throw a word out there, a name out there for you. Thomas Kinkade, perhaps, would be one of those names. As an artist, maybe you've emulated him in your art. I don't know. But he was the symbolic for what it meant to be a Christian artist, was really Thomas Kinkade. Music was very predictable, I would say, because whatever was popular in the culture became popular in Christian music like 2 years later, became, what Christian music started to copy. And so you had kind of this sense in which everything in Christianity was just basically doing a cheap knockoff of what was happening in culture, but not really innovating on its own. And I don't really know that that's what Christianity should be defined as, like this knockoff culture. It was almost like AI before there was AI. What are your thoughts about how, maybe take it from the meta level first, like what are some of your thoughts on just how Christianity's been walked side by side with art in the modern era? And we'll talk about maybe how Christianity's been worked with artists in the past, but how about in the modern era? What's your perspective on that as an artist yourself?
Well, first of all, that's fascinating to hear about your experience from the 90s. That I didn't grow up in the church, so I don't really have much context for that.
Yeah.
And I guess I guess that background kind of colors the way that I'll answer your question in terms of my knowledge of the church and the arts, and also growing up in New York State and upstate New York and in America. So all of that colors that answer too. But so maybe I'll start there, because those were some of my early church experiences. And I guess what I would say is that most of my peers loved my peers in church, but there just weren't that many people who identified as artists. There were musicians. I will say that definitely lots of people that were musicians and playing and on worship teams. And so I think to answer your question, like geography, I think actually has a really important piece to play in the way that the church interacts with the arts, because the church is made up of people, and those people represent their communities. And so I had a lot of friends who were, medical students at the University of Rochester, residents, accountants, engineers. Rochester is a big engineering town. Teachers, etc., nurses, and those are fantastic vocations, but there just isn't the same kind of critical mass in terms of concentration of artists that make up congregations, and so as a result, churches represent that, and so my exposure to church and art was pretty minimal. I guess what I would observe was more the way that art was used for the programs of the church, whether that was videography, graphic design, music, of course, is probably the big one that we think about. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good thing to point out, I think, the difference in our experiences, whether we grew up in the church or not. I share a similar experience to you, John, and thinking about this question we're starting with here, which is basically why are we talking about art in a season titled "The Credibility of Christianity"? My experience is similar to yours, John, where I think especially in my teen years, as most of my life I was a closet creative, I'd call it, but starting to come out of that closet creatively and appreciate art in different ways, in some of maybe the simpler, more popular forms like film and even art as it's on social media and people are sharing, graphic design work and such. Noticing, especially in my teen years, that work that seemed to be labeled as Christian, be it music or film or design, sometimes feeling kind of cheesy, sometimes having this just so explicit agenda. It seemed that like, oh, there has to be a cross in your graphic design, or the gospel has to be explicitly articulated in your movie, and by a main character who's perfectly redeemed at the end of the story. These types of things kind of in those years for me, those teen years, coming to kind of have a chip on my shoulder maybe towards what it looked like the relationship between the church and art and beauty was, one of shallow engagement, of having to have things all buttoned up and pretty.
Yeah.
That's where I kind of encountered it and started thinking about this question first as well.
Here's a question for you, Sash. This is the benefit of knowing your story so well. So walking alongside of somebody for a prolonged amount of time, you get a chance to know their backstory, and I couldn't fit Sasha's story in a blurb, a bio blurb. But one of the things I think that people can critique rightly about art is, especially art within the church in its modern sense, is that it is, as Gage described, nice and buttoned up and pretty, and it only portrays, sometimes we only portray the positive side of things, but we're often molded by suffering, and we're often molded in an intense way in our lives through pain and walking through those areas. So if we don't have a way to acknowledge pain and suffering in our art, I think we miss out on something really, really vital. How is pain and suffering? I'm just diving into the deep end with you because I can. How has pain and suffering influenced the way that you create?
That's a great question. For anyone that's gone through loss, which is all of us in some way, grieving's always with us, and so I think, I bring that into my creative process. But in many ways for me, just, personally, making art is a form of respite. It's a form of maybe some healing happening. It's a way to process the events of my life. Similar to journaling or any kind of reflective activity. The creative element of it, to create something beautiful when you're going through a really hard time, I think is a type of hope and a type of resistance and a type of kind of declaration, that good can still exist amidst the hardship. Yeah.
Wow, that's an amazing statement right there. You've raised, and you're currently raising a child with special needs. That's a big part of your story. You've experienced loss.
Big part of my story.
Yeah. How has that played into your creative process, like what you're describing right now?
So I recently had a show in Manhattan, and someone said, seeing your work in person and knowing your life with Judah and your caregiving, they said it makes so much sense because I can see the patience in your work. Now I think that was always part of the way I'm wired. Like even before kids, I was always pretty detail oriented. And in some way, maybe that prepared me for my journey as a caregiver, but there is a sense of taking my time. Judah really makes me slow down a lot. He disrupts a lot of what I want to get done all the time, and that can be super frustrating in the moment, but to accept that in my best times and to see him before me and what he needs as not a burden, but an opportunity to care for him. I think about my work that way. I'll never forget preparing for another show a couple years ago, and an artist saw the paintings. They were about to be delivered to the gallery, and this artist said, "They look so perfect." And I knew what she was trying to say, but I said, I really think about it less about perfection and more about care. Like I really want to give each painting the care and attention that it deserves. And so craftsmanship and, really a sense of attention is part of my work. And so I think it's, our lives are so integrated. So my art making, it's so much a part of my story with my kids, et cetera. So I guess that's how I would answer. Yeah.
That's good. That's really rich. I really want to I hope we get to hear a lot more about, your unique approach, vision to art, and even your theology for it as it's developed over the years. Before we go there, though, I want to give you one last chance to respond to the why are we talking about this? And when we talked before this briefly, before pressing record, one of the things you hit on that I really loved was to the layer of credibility explicitly in the relationship, perhaps between art, beauty, credibility, and Christianity. Would you share a bit with us about that?
Yeah, as I was preparing for the podcast, I was thinking about that word credibility. What does credibility mean? And, I was thinking it's basically a way to back up a claim. I was thinking about like two-step verification on my email when I need to get a text message to make sure it's me, or any of these ways that we have to verify our identity these days. And in a sense, that's what credibility is. It's saying there's reasons to trust this thing, that it is what it says it is. And I think art and beauty are just one of those data points or one of those opportunities for credibility to authenticate Christianity, just like some of your other guests, like science. I think I would put in that same category. I loved, what the doctor that you had on said. He said, I can't prove that Christianity is true, but each of us has to make a faith step. And because of these data points, that helps me to put my faith in Christianity. And I would say the same could be said of art and beauty. I think there's a wealth of historical and theological foundation and evidence that really link and tie art and beauty with Christianity and affirm its purpose in our lives in the world.
What do you think the strongest? What do you think the strongest one is for you? Like as you think about that, like what's the strongest compelling evidence for art and beauty pointing to Christianity, to the message of Christianity? What's there?
Yeah. So the more that I've thought about it, we live in a society that compartmentalizes things, and we love categorizing. Categorizing is great, but in some ways that can lead to sort of separation. So like, there's artists, there's engineers. I did it when I talked about the different vocations, right? We group people, according to sort of where we know to put them. And so art and beauty is over here and science is over here. But the more that I've thought about it, I really feel like art and beauty are innate to the human experience and condition, like across cultures, no matter where you go, across history, people are having experiences of beauty, and people are creating art and responding to art. And it's always been that way. And so the more that I've thought about it, it's not that some people are artists and some people aren't. We all are interacting with beauty and art all the time and always have been. And so for me, that human experience speaks to our design, and it speaks to God as the creator. That's how he describes himself. I mean, the most incredible artist, the most incredible creator, like just fantastic. And then beauty being this universal concept that all of us respond to. We don't have a choice sometimes. We just can't, we're just stopped in our track. I mean, for me right now, it's these cute like animal videos on Instagram. Yeah. They're just amazing. Like a panda munching on a carrot. It's just like, what is that? Like, it's just the little hamster, like munching on a piece of meat. And like, I love these animal videos, but I also love waterfall. I mean, so they're, and flowers are one of the things that just mesmerize me. You could go to any culture in the world, doesn't matter what their worldview is, and they have a concept of beauty. And so to me, that tells me that beauty is one of these sort of intrinsic values of the world, and has its origin in the one who is sort of the epitome of beauty, which I believe is God. So I see a really strong foundation there in terms of our lived experience. And I think for people listening to the podcast, I think that's one reason that art and beauty make Christianity credible. I mean, imagine if the message that people were receiving was, this thing that you experience all the time and love isn't great. It isn't good. And it doesn't have any place in the church. Yeah. And people are thinking like, wait a minute, it just doesn't seem to line up with reality. Like, I love stories. I love Netflix and Spotify. I love the expression of human creativity. I'm compelled and attracted to things in the world because they're beautiful. Like, yes, you know what I mean? I think that, I mean, we could stop right there and just say, yes, that's good. And I think if anyone had received the message that it wasn't good, maybe that's some of the dissonance of like, I don't understand, like, why doesn't this community value what seems to be so natural to humanity?
Yeah, that's an interesting thought process to go through, because I think we've inherited this Western mindset, really, that does separate things out. It's kind of more. It's more from Aristotle than it is from Jesus, which is this distinct, the soul is one thing, the physical world is another. The physical world is less than the soul. And you don't see Jesus, when you really interact with Jesus, you don't really see that. You see Jesus appreciating both at the same time. He's never saying of the physical world, this is a horrible thing or this is less than. He's healing people in the physical world. Jesus was probably a creator in a real way as well. I mean, he learned carpentry as a trade. He probably served in that way. He was a creative. Yeah. And you see Jesus actually interacting with people in a physical way. Yes, he was giving them spiritual healing, but he's also giving them physical healing. So I think it's just important for us to take a look and go, where is my mindset shaped by? And what is informing that? Like, is it, for Christians, we should look at the Bible and go, is this really in here? Or is it really more just something I've inherited through my culture?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that. Yeah, go ahead, Gage.
I was just going to say, one thing I hope, we talked about this too beforehand, that folks walk away from this episode hearing is, if you are a creative, if you are an artist who have felt alienated or out of place in the church, we really hope this conversation is something that changes that, that extends a really, really hard, we need you, you're significant here. Even have a unique and powerful calling. Yeah, I think that's for sure true. It's reflecting the image of God. I mean, to have those, and we all have, I think, some sort of innate creativity about us because we're made in the image of God. Each person likes to create in their own unique way. It's interesting, if you just watch kids, they will each create in their own unique way, but they're very creative. They're born creative. We're born creative.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that's an important thing to recognize.
Yeah. And, the church is made up of diverse parts. I love the analogy of the body, so one's a hand, one's, X, Y, or Z. And the church needs artists because they're part of that body. They're like, we can't function to our full potential without that demographic because artists, it's interesting, like they, it's not just about what they can produce, but it's about the way that they see the world. Artists tend to be commentators. They're observers. They always feel a little bit kind of outside of society a little bit. It's just how they're wired. But that allows them to sort of observe what's happening and to give commentary on it, and often to be a prophetic voice and to speak into it. And so that's a gifting, right? That's in congregations that's so important. Often artists too are very empathetic. They're feelers. They feel things very, very deeply. And oftentimes, they're very in touch with injustice and suffering and hypocrisy, and they feel it so much. And I think churches need to be full of those kind of people because we're all hurting, and often artists are able to connect with people just intuitively, without any counseling degrees or just training. They just know because that's their lived experience. And so just to affirm what you said, John, I agree. There's so much, and what you said, Gage, there's so much that artists and creatives bring to our world, and there's so much that they can bring to local congregations.
Yeah, I mean, as you're talking there's something about what you're saying that's ringing true to me. But I'm wondering, like, do you have any examples, like, of artists that you know who really are, they don't have to be Christians necessarily, but just artists you know that are like this prophetic voice in their artwork or their process, that you observe them and you say, oh, wow, there's something prophetic in what's happening here. Like, there's something that is needed in the art that they're bringing to the world. They're actually delivering more than just visually. They're delivering something else. Do you have any artists that come to mind, as whether they're friends or just other artists?
Yeah, and let me start a little bit more broadly, because I actually think I've done some thinking about this too. I've really come to believe that artists are in some ways occupying similar space to the space that the church wants to occupy in society. Meaning this, like, take New York City, for example. This is a city where people work incredibly hard. They're very driven by career. It's very difficult to live here. And as a result, ambition and getting ahead, career is an obsession. And yet simultaneously, in the most expensive city in the country, one of the most difficult places to live, you have the greatest concentration of working artists, perhaps in the world. There's no accurate numbers on that, but definitely in the country. And you have all of these people who could have pursued careers that would have brought stability, but they've given that up in one sense to pursue their craft, and to share that with the world. And so in a sense, when you ask, do I know artists that are a prophetic voice? I kind of feel like the artist community in general is a prophetic voice, because just as the church wants to be a countercultural symbol in society to say, no, something is off here. There's a different way to live. Like, this isn't going to satisfy. Like, artists are already asking those questions, and they've already determined, I'm ready to take a different path in life. I'm ready to give up some of those earthly comforts for the sake of something more. And so in a way, I feel like artists are operating as a countercultural symbol. They're saying making money isn't all that life is about, and they're often like in these spaces of contemplation and commentary. And so think about what that does to a fabric of a city. When you have a group of people, a large group of people who are asking those questions and are devoted to a practice of making things that speak to the culture. And it's what helps a city flourish, because everyone then participates in that work, and then they get to participate in those spaces that those artists make. So that's like the broad answer. And I get really excited about it, because I kind of feel like artists are sort of like modern day monks and nuns living among us. They've sort of taken these vows of poverty, so to speak, for the sake of a calling. So I feel like there's so much synergy with what the church is doing in the world and what artists are doing. That's why I'm so passionate about helping to connect them.
Well, so as you're talking, I'm like, oh my goodness, I want to go down 3 different lines of thought right now, but I'm going to pick one, because I love the passion that you're bringing, and I haven't ever thought of it that way. So I'm curious, and now I'm just spacing on what the line that I wanted to go down, because it was so good. I was so excited, Scott. You got me so excited about it. I was captivated by, here it is. Do you think then the church and its relationship with artists, do you feel like maybe the modern American church, one of the problems with it isn't calling artists up to a higher standard, in a sense, like isn't asking more of them? Like artists look at it and say, this place is so like too shallow for what I'm doing. Like I want a higher call than what I'm receiving right now. Does that resonate with your experience?
It does. And I have so much compassion for church leaders and the way churches are structured. It's not intentional.
Yeah.
It's just that if you haven't lived that experience and you don't understand what's that kind of calling, it's very difficult to call people into that. I love the church. And yet a lot of my experience in terms of church leadership, churches tend to attract leaders that not all. There are definitely creatives and artists that come into church leadership, but there are a lot that tend to follow more of like the business CEO sort of project management, like that kind of culture. Like they would feel at home there more so than they would feel at home, at a gallery. And as a result, when you have leadership that just culturally isn't in that space, it's very difficult to think about that demographic and how to call them up to something higher. So I've got a ton of compassion, I really do.
Yeah.
Well, I think something too that you touched on already is not only is it perhaps unfamiliar, but sometimes there's a scariness to it, because if artists are these, modern day monks or modern day prophets in the same way, like with the countercultural voice saying, no, something's not okay, would just make as much money as you can here. There's a higher something, and they're this prophetic voice towards culture at large. They can also be that prophetic voice towards some things of how the church currently is. And that can be scary for leaders, I think, and for all of us to have that prophetic voice shown potentially on us in some moments.
Yeah. I mean, art is hard to control. It really is. And our response to art is out of our control often. I think that's one of the amazing things about art and its power is that you can be affected by a piece of art unwillingly. Like, you know what I mean? It bypasses the mind and hits directly to your heart. I'll tell you a story. About a month ago, I went to see Martin Scorsese's new film, Killers of the Flower Moon. Incredible piece of art, incredible film. And yet, as the movie went on, it became agonizing for me, because the picture that he was painting, the way that he had written these characters, the way that they embodied human greed and exploitation, the suffering, it was so agonizing to watch because it was such a vivid portrayal. And as soon as the credits began to roll, involuntarily, I didn't walk into that theater, thinking this was going to happen, but I just started weeping. I could not stop. I literally was standing in that little tunnel that goes out of the theater, just weeping. And the guy cleaning up the popcorn was just like, it's a powerful film. And I was like, yeah, but what it did is it triggered something in me. It opened up this valve of my own suffering, my own pain, my own anger at the exploitation of humanity. That's the power of art, but that's uncontrollable. It's almost in the same category of like when revival happens, and people are just like, I don't know what's happening. Like that's kind of in the same category of what art can do. And so when you think about that in the context of a church community, it's difficult to feel out of control, and especially I think, in a lot of church communities, there's a high emphasis on sound doctrine, faithful biblical teaching, which is great. I'm all for that. But as a result, sometimes that leads to a very high level of control. So everything is sort of systematized and monitored, and you don't really break with that sort of system without planning and preparation. And as a result, that can make artists feel stifled. That doesn't leave a lot of room sometimes for the unknown and the mystery that art can produce. Now, that's not to say that great art can't be experienced within a church community through proper planning and preparation. I guess what I'm trying to say, though, is that it can feel threatening if you have a high sense of control and you want to have really tight messaging and you don't want anything to deviate from that messaging. You may not be able to make a lot of space for art. Yeah.
Well,
does that make sense?
That totally makes sense. And I think what you're describing is, in a sense, it's, as Christians, we talk about the Holy Spirit and his influence in our lives. And the Holy Spirit is a very disruptive force, in our lives, we would say as Christians. Like, by submitting ourselves to the Holy Spirit, it's like you don't know what he's going to call you to do. You don't know ahead of time all the things that he's going to do within your life as you say yes to him, and it is, you can't systematize him very easily, and so there's this sense of it's a little bit wild, and maybe that's something that we have lost as a church. And that's not to point fingers, but that's just to look and maybe even in a sense of longing, wonder, have we lost some of that wildness, some of that surprise, some of that ability to be moved at any moment during the day? And I think that should cause us to take a deep look inside and go, is that true? Have we lost a little bit of that? And maybe art allows us to put our finger on that a little bit more.
I think that actually gives us a great opportunity to kind of ask that question, like for those, especially those listening who maybe they're familiar with Browncroft, right? And that's how they heard about this podcast. And they come from more of a modern Protestant church tradition that looks a lot like a service at Browncroft. And to them, they relate to this tension we're describing. And I want to pause and take a moment and ask you, Sasha, has this always been the case? Give us kind of a brief reflection on the church throughout history and even the diversity of the church as it exists in the world now across traditions. How has this relationship with art that we've described, how is that similar or different across time and place?
Yeah, so I have to preface by saying, I'm not an art historian or a church historian, but I'll lay the same foundation that I did in the beginning, that because I believe that art and beauty are innate to the human experience, we can find evidence of their existence and their coexistence and integration with faith communities from the beginning, even before the church. Think about the Book of Psalms, which is this beautiful piece of art. Scripture in general, I mean, literature, the temple being built. I mean, there's so many examples, but as it relates to the early church, I think about music. That's always been part of the Christian experience in terms of the arts. And one that we don't sometimes categorize as art, but it totally is. And my friend John Iamaio knows this is true because this man is an artist. This man is an artist when it comes to food, the culinary arts. The culinary arts, and of course, we wouldn't categorize it maybe as a culinary art. You would say the early church met and ate food together. Yeah. Okay, they did, but it was a sensory, physical experience that brought pleasure. Eating is pleasurable. It's a form of beauty. So do you see what I'm saying? So there's an integration that I think we just don't often consider. And then there are more tangible examples, even in the early church. Frescoes, from the beginning, visualizing scripture was really important, particularly as not everyone was literate. From the early days of the church, you have visual representation of the Gospels, of the stories of Jesus, to be able to teach and share the good news. And if I could just say really quick, I think that's one of the positive motivators that I would share for churches. Is that's what's so exciting to me, is like communicating the beauty of the gospel. Like we need to use every available method, and art is so powerful, like we just talked about, and not everybody is going to connect with truth in the same way. And so I think let's use every facet of our human potential to communicate the beauty of the gospel, and the arts can do that. And that's what the early church was doing. They were using visual representation of these stories to communicate truth about God. So then fast forward, I don't know, like this is where my history gets a little, like from 350 to the Renaissance. I don't know what was happening.
That's okay. None of the rest of us do.
The Roman Empire was splitting, but I will say this too. As it relates to like East versus West. Oftentimes we think about church history just in terms of the West, but from the beginning, Christianity was spreading into Africa, into Northern Africa, Ethiopia. It was going east into the Persian Empire, into Iran, even into China very early on, into Asia, Central Asia. So I just bring that up to say, in each of East, West, South, all of those have evidence of art and beauty being incorporated with the life of the church. I think most of us are when we think about art in the church, we think about the Renaissance. We think about patronage. We think about Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. We think about the Vatican. We think about all of the works that were commissioned, rightly so. I mean, just an incredible emphasis on beauty. And, you know, there's the counter points to a lot of what happened in terms of the opulence and extravagance and corruption. Sure, you could go there, but really ingrained in the church was this sense that physicality mattered, that beauty matters, and that it is a way to connect with people and to represent God on earth through craftsmanship, through beauty, through architecture. And even after the Protestant Reformation, one of my favorite painters is Rembrandt, you know, a Dutch painter. And he was the most prolific biblical painter, maybe of all time. I mean, he did so many paintings and drawings from the Bible. And think about it. I mean, at that time, right, the Bible is being translated into like the common vernacular. And so again, this was a way to disseminate these biblical stories and to, you know, he's encountering scripture in his native language and then being able to paint. So anyways, those are just a few examples. Again, I'm not a church historian or art historian that much. So, but I think you can find examples throughout history, especially when you broaden the way we categorize art and beauty.
And to realize we're coming at this from a particular cultural angle as well. Like I would say the Eastern, if you look at the grand scope of what is Christianity, the Eastern Orthodox kind of version of Christianity is still places a very high value on art and beauty and images, and it's very, very much part of what they do. Yeah, I love that.
I will never forget. I'll never forget visiting the Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, a couple years ago. But what was so fascinating, it was so ornate inside. I mean, every surface had been considered. The paintings, the sculptures, the ceiling was painted, like everything was curated. But the thing was, what I learned, it wasn't just for ornamentation. Everything was helping to tell the story. Even the incense, like it was all part of telling the story, right? So it wasn't just the preaching or the singing. The environment itself was helping to communicate this story about God. That was huge, because for a long part of my Christian life, I thought, well, cathedrals or this or that, it's just kind of like, you know, extravagant. But I didn't realize that there was this deep theological underpinning and foundation to it. You know, it was amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a hope in that. Like, oh man, that's an actual, that could actually be not just in that one setting, but we could all learn from that. Like there's an opportunity to learn in these spaces and to go, wow, that could be a part of who we are, or at least invite that in to shape a little bit. It doesn't have to look the exact same way, but it could, what would it look like if we experimented more with the entire space pointing to Jesus, not just words pointing to Jesus?
Yeah. And, you know, John, like you taught me this many years ago. And I think now there's been more widespread acceptance that for a long time, the church had a blind spot when it came to emotional health, right? That this was an area of discipleship and holistic growth that had just sort of been overlooked. And so for a long time, emphasis was just on like these kind of narrowly defined spiritual remedies to people's issues. And then all of a sudden it was like, oh, like actually there's this whole part of our humanity that also needs to be integrated. And like, I think there's a parallel when it comes to our physicality. We're physical beings. We're embodied. Jesus was incarnate. God became flesh and lived among us. We are vessels of the Holy Spirit. And so the physical is so important. It's a conduit for the spiritual. There's an integration. And so as it comes to the way that we congregate and the way that we think about communicating about God, again, like how could our physical environments, our bodies, like we know now through, I mean, if you look at like, early education into higher education, like physical learning, like not just learning by sitting in a row, but actually getting out and physically doing activities, right? That's another way of learning.
Mm-hmm.
These are all things that I'm very interested in, because I kind of feel like it's this untapped part of our humanity that if that was brought into connection with the spiritual and the emotional, it would be amazing, you know?
Yeah.
And it's not that it's not happening, but it could be cultivated even more.
Love that. Such a beautiful picture.
Yeah. In some ways, I'm jealous of you, Sasha. I used to live in New York and still keep in touch with some of the church communities down there who it's worth saying, like, it's not, I don't know if Mr. Listener, Mrs. Listener, what your, church experience is, whether it has been artistically rich or not. It is worth acknowledging, even today, there are church communities beautifully embracing the arts and incorporating it thoroughly. And there are a couple communities there in New York I miss, connecting with and engaging with their just artistic richness. Anything to add about that? Like right now, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, but I think Broncroft is a great example of that. And I'm not just saying that because I'm on your podcast. I know that you all have partnered with Forefront, which is an organization that I love dearly, that is committed to faith and art. You're doing this podcast and probably lots of other things that I'm not aware of. So thank you. I always feel like I want to say thank you to any church that's even dipping their toes into this realm of creativity and faith. But also, you're right. Like New York definitely has a lot of representation. I talked about it being a city with the greatest concentration of working artists, in the country for sure. And that is then represented in congregations. It also seems to attract church leadership that love the arts. It's hard not to in this city, and there's just so much everywhere. And it's such an influential demographic, from Broadway to TV and film writers. I was in the park yesterday with my little pup and met this wonderful couple, a photographer and illustrator, one from Sweden and the others from the UK. And it just reminded me. I mean, it's just all around, And again, and then we talked. The question I asked them was, "How do you sustain life here for the long term?" Because they had been here for 20 years. It's hard, but it. So to that question, and to your not question, to your statement that churches are working with the arts in New York, I think it goes back to demographics.
Yeah, no, that's good. That's
potentially.
Good.
I don't know. I don't want to make it just about demographics.
Yeah.
No, we hear you, and thanks for that encouragement. To make a quick kind of little pause in the middle of the episode, I didn't plan to ask this question, but for our listeners who are hoping, to grow in their artistic capacity. As it's integrated with faith, potentially. Are there any groups, be them in person or online, you would that just jump to top of the list of, hey, here are great organizations to connect with, great groups of other, artists trying to integrate spirituality and art deeply and well?
Yeah, it really depends on where you are in the country. If you're in Rochester, New York, Forefront 360, that I'd recommend you check them out in Browncroft. In New York, there's a lot going on. So Church of the City is doing a great work with Renaissance, which is this incredible ministry that brings artists together from different churches. There's some stuff happening in California. I went to a conference there on art and faith near LA. I can't remember the church's name, but so there's a handful of organizations and churches. If you're in Texas, in Dallas, I think it's called Art House, which is a nonprofit that works in the art and faith space. Yeah, so there's cool. Many, but just depends on where you live.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for that little sidebar.
Yeah, well, and Gage, you do a ton with Forefront 360. Like, right. You do you're like the man for them, right?
I'm a volunteer, but I appreciate that affirmation.
I will say Gage does a lot with
Yeah, and if you're local.
In his own right, is a poet.
Oh, gee.
I'm going to say that.
We're going to close this sidebar very shortly. But if you are a Rochester person, please, reach out. I'd be happy to connect you with Forefront and some of the things we do here.
There you go.
Coming back to the primary.
It was like we had our own little sponsor in the middle there. That was nice. Yeah.
And maybe at the end I can share a couple more resources like books and journals. That aren't organizations, but they're just kind of, be great.
Okay. Yeah. And we'll include those in the show notes too.
Yeah.
somehow. Yeah.
Somehow we're going to do it.
right.
I just say it and then, we'll put that in the show notes.
I love show notes. It always makes me happy. It's like, oh, there it is.
We're going to put Sasha's art in the show notes. I just said it, so now we got to do it. I don't know how we'd do that, but
Can you put a link to those cute animals, like one of those reels? That'd be please, that account. Seriously.
There's a chance Nate might do that.
I will send you the account. It's totally wonderful.
All right, and with that,
love it.
Back to our feature programming. Okay, yeah, let's come back here. This is where I really want to start landing the ship here. We had the tension. What's the tension? We talked about it in the relationship between sometimes Christians, the church, and art. We talked a little bit about the history of the relationship with art, but now let's just tackle head on. Really, the crux of it is there. Let's explore the compatibility or lack, but hopefully the compatibility between the unique compatibility between Christianity and the Christian church and art. How would you start to answer that question? Is Christianity compatible? Does it give us a strong or a weak? What's it lend the artist, the creative? What's it lend as far as a theology of beauty even?
Mm-hmm. To be honest, I feel like I'm just scratching the surface of its compatibility. And once you start to think about the connections, it's really wonderful, like how many there are. So is it compatible? Absolutely. I don't know if it's uniquely compatible, but I would say in terms of going back to that question of credibility, definitely compatible. And there's a couple things that I think are unique that I'll mention. The first, we talked a lot about beauty. We didn't really define beauty. And there's a lot of different ways to think about what beauty is. You could think about it in terms of universal aesthetics, the reason that we, feel a sense of awe when we see a waterfall or a flower. I think that's really wonderful. Some people might think that's superficial, but I actually think that there's something important there. But there is another type of beauty that I think Christianity can speak to, and kind of talks to that compatibility with artists uniquely. And that's, John, you kind of asked about suffering. Mm-hmm. And I think Christianity sort of asks the question, like, can something very difficult also be beautiful? One of the provocative questions that I've asked, and I really thought about this, is, was the cross beautiful? In one sense, no. It was horrific and terrible. It was the worst day ever. I mean, it was the suffering and the pain, unbearable, terrible. What Jesus went through on the cross was not beautiful, and yet what God was doing through that act, I think, was beautiful. It was beautiful because of what motivated that act. It was a loving act. It was Jesus literally giving his life for ours. Self-sacrifice is beautiful. And so I think there's different levels of beauty, but I think Christianity gives a picture of how redemption can be beautiful. And I think artists kind of intuitively feel that and know that. Artists are used to making things that other people would discard and overlook. They're used to transforming things. And Christianity claims to be about transformation and taking something that might have been overlooked, considered ugly, and making it beautiful. And that act being beautiful. So that's one thing that I think is really wonderful about Christianity and the arts. How a loving act can be beautiful, even if it's filled with so much pain.
Wow. That in and of itself is a very deep statement, but one that I think is important for us not to just gloss over, because that is true about Christianity. It recognizes suffering in a unique way that other faith traditions don't. it isn't just talking about the inevitability of suffering, because many faith traditions do that. But Christianity, I think, is unique in that it says God suffered. Like the creator of all of this, not only did he create it, he's not outside of it. He's actually becoming one of us and suffering with us. So can the beauty of that, can there be something beautiful about that message in and of it? Like, is that message beautiful? And Sasha, I think you bring that out. I think that is a beautiful message.
It's so compelling.
Right. It's
so compelling. It's what we all want. We all want to be treated that way. We all want someone to see the potential in us and say, you're worth it. That's beautiful.
Yeah.
You know?
And when push comes to shove, we want someone to suffer with us, right? I mean, not suffer with us, but to know the suffering and to be with us in the midst of suffering. Anyway, you're going to say,
and so the historical accounts of our faith sort of expand even our concept of beauty, you know, and it's so multifaceted, and I think it also gives us permission to continue to create in the midst of so much suffering. I was sitting with an artist a few weeks ago, and he was so distraught at the state of the world, the wars going on, the suffering. You know, New York City is in multiple crises all the time. It's just so much going on. He was so weighed down, and he just felt like, how can we make art in the midst of this? Why does it even matter? Like, it just, you know, it seems so insignificant and sort of narcissistic to be making objects when the world is falling apart around us. And I get that feeling. And I said, you know, what helps me is a framework for the suffering, you know, and I think having a framework for it allows us to avoid hopelessness, because we know that it's not hopeless, even though things look so bad, and we can keep looking back at the cross, that there's hope, you know, because of what Jesus accomplished for us, and because of what he's doing, even despite everything that we can see. And I think that's what allows me to continue to make paintings, because I know that it's not all on my shoulders, but also that maybe, just maybe, making a painting could be part of that healing, could be part of that transformation, could be part of opening up a space for someone who's so weighed down, you know? So I didn't articulate that exactly well, but I hope you get sort of the idea that the message of the gospel, I think, actually allows us to create, because we know suffering isn't meaningless.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, that's so deep. And Sash, I could sit here with you for hours and talk about this stuff. I just love it. I just love talking with you in general. I'm imagining a nice steak in front of us right now, and we're just sharing it. We've been there before. We've been there over many steaks before. It's so great.
So many ribs, chicken.
Yeah. I'm just, yeah. But how would we summarize this? Because ultimately we gotta press stop on this recording at some point. And what takeaway message do you have for people who are engaging with this? Let's just all, if we can, just share from our heart. Someone's engaging with it. They've made it this far, you know, somehow. God bless you for hanging out this long with us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
You can run a long time.
Right. But like, what would we say to somebody who's feeling on the outside, who feels like maybe I'm not accepted in this place, like apart, not one of the Christian community, because they feel so aligned with maybe the arts? What do you have to say?
I would say I think a lot about you. Think about you all the time. And as I was preparing for this podcast, you were who I was thinking about. I was thinking about that feeling of being outside of the group, not belonging, feeling like the way that you see the world is just so different, that your perspective doesn't have a place. That doesn't feel good. And I'm sorry that that's been your experience. You're not alone. And many people have felt that way, not just artists, but that's an unfortunate part of the human condition when it comes to belonging. But I would say, I hope this podcast has given you a little bit of hope that there is a place for you. Not only is there a place for you, like, oh, we made space for you at the table. We need you at the table. Like the way that you see the world, the way that you connect with people, the art that you have inside you needs to come out. It needs to bless the world. It needs to bless our congregations. It needs to be cultivated because your gifts matter. They matter so much, and they're already being used, maybe I'm sure outside of the church here and there, but like the church would be a richer place with you there. That's what I would say is I see you, you're not alone. And there is incredible compatibility in terms of art, beauty, and our faith.
That's wonderfully said, Sasha. So, Gage, do you have anything else you would say to those wonderful people?
Just in closing, final thoughts here. And thank you so much, Sasha. That's really rich. And this whole conversation has been so rich. I've appreciated it tremendously. Even as we were closing here, in talking about the cross, right, is that image of beauty through suffering. One of the popular, I think, challenges I've heard to Christianity is that it's supernatural escapism. That it's just this kind of religious escapism from the harsh realities of life, a way to dodge the painful moments or realities. And I don't think that's fair. You mentioned the cross. I was talking to someone last night, and it came up that we mentioned the Psalms in this episode. 2/3 of the Psalms are lament. And even in the art that exists, call it the literature of Scripture or the gospel itself with the cross and so much, is truly, I think, an invitation deeper into reality. And I love what artists bring to that calling of the church. I think the call of the church, of the people of God, I think God's invitation to us is, in fact, to truly deeply step into the realities of life and therein discover Him. And I think his invitation to artists and all Christians is to do that, to help others do that. And there's such just a unique, artists have, like we've said, such a unique compassion and ability to connect with people in those realities and display them in their full truth. That gets the full picture. It's not mere darkness, depravity, and it's not superficial hope either. I think we're given examples of that throughout Christian history, and we're called to that now. And so I'm just excited about as God continues to work in the church, how that might continue, even through listeners perhaps of this podcast.
Definitely. And I would just say, along the lines of both you, I'm just thankful you're listening. And I'm thankful that you are who you are, and you were created the way you were created for a reason. And God is a creator. Like, He's the one that started the whole thing. If we start looking at the ultimate artist, we'd have to point to God. And as God described, as we describe the mission of God, even within the church, let's say, Ephesians describes it this way: you are God's masterpiece. He's talking to people who Jesus has redeemed, and he says, you are God's masterpiece. So the world is God's original creation story, but then He's creating, even in us, this other masterpiece that we're created to go and do good works. But there's a masterpiece that you are. You're part of this grand masterpiece that God is creating, and you're a vital piece of that. So I hope that whoever is listening today feels a sense of hope, like you were saying, Sasha, just that God can use them too, no matter who you are. So,
hey, as we wrap up here, how could people continue to follow and get in touch with you, Sasha?
If you just Google my name, Sasha Hallock, which I'm sure you can see in the show notes, my website, Instagram, those are the two main ways to connect with me.
Yeah. And his artwork is fantastic, people. I don't know if I've already said that. I probably have, but I got one of the pieces on display in my own home, and I look at it every day, and continue to love it each day even more than I loved it the day before. So if you want to buy some of his art, I would highly recommend that as well, because he's a great artist. So anyway, there's that too. So
thanks, John.
Yeah.
Perfect.
All right.
Sasha, thank you so much for your time. We look forward to connecting soon, and to our listeners, see you next episode.